in July 2000, the President of the United States, should I say Clinton the first, landed in India. Among other things, he spent a day in a national park near Delhi known as Ranthambore, where he had the privilege of seeing a wild tiger. It was a tiger nicknamed, like many tigers in Ranthambore, it's called Bamburam, which in Hindi means Bangla. For some reason, he got the name wrong and kept calling it Boomerang. And the next day when he spoke to the Confederation of Indian Industry in Bombay, they were all ecstatic, and they went out immediately and purchased books about Ranthambore. Ranthambore is a very interesting park. There are probably half a dozen books in it. It has the most intensively photographed and photogenic wild tigers in the world. It's one of the first places in the world where in the 70s through to the 2000s, the tiger, which was earlier known as a nocturnal animal, dropped its nocturnal cloak. And you got fascinating accounts of individual tigresses and their families, the sorts of which we were reading in Savannah, Africa in the 60s or even earlier. Clinton didn't know this, but he was not the first dignitary to visit Ranthambore. In 1961, Prince Philip visited Ranthambore. The Duke of Edinburgh, of course, didn't just see a male tiger, he shot a male tiger. And the reason for this is very important because right till the end of the 60s, Ranthambore was a hunting reserve. It was a hunting reserve of the Maharajas of Jaipur. And I think that this, in a sense, can frame the way I want to approach this subject. Most of us have been looking at the forest in terms of trees, in terms of regrowth, resurgence, or deforestation. But any sense of the forest must, to me at least, look at it perhaps in a slightly wider sense, to look at the flora and fauna, native or not, we can debate what is and is not native, which includes the various life forms, including the larger taxa. One thinks of India as a country of 1 billion people, but tends to forget that it's also a country with 503 or 504 species of mammals. I'm referring to wild ones. But it's interesting, if you look at the definition of the forest, there's a very interesting definition of the forest by a very good historical geographer in England called Oliver Rackham, The Last Forest. He said that the forest in medieval England was defined as a place where the king, and I note, only the king could hunt the deer. And I think this is very important when one is looking at modern preservation and conservation. I must clarify that if you put all the protected areas in India together, all the national parks and sanctuaries, and most were created in the period between 1970 and 90, they add up to just about 5% of the landscape. If you just took all the tiger reserves together, and I have to say this because Rod Neumann was referring to Selous, if you took all the Indian tiger reserves together and put them into Selous, you'd still have space left over. Selous is about 44,000 square kilometers. All the Indian tiger reserves are about 30,000 square kilometers. But I think we must begin with a very important acknowledgement of a significant material change. I was very struck listening to Kathy yesterday about the retreat and the resurgence of the forest over time. And I think that's a striking feature pre-1800 in what we now know as India. Ranthambore itself, till the 14th century, was a very important fort. It's very important in terms of battles fought by the sultans of Delhi and the Mughals. From around the mid-14th century, it goes into ruins. And even today, it's very well-known photographs of Ranthambore with tigers lolling around where kings and queens once slept and so on and so forth. So I think this picture of the retreat and flux of the forest is a valid one. But I think the picture changes in the last 150 to 200 years. Let me give you a couple of statistics. I don't normally like statistics, but I think they would help. You know, from around the 1870s to the 1920s, there's a very intensive program which runs concurrently with the enclosure of vast areas of forest estate. So by 1904, the British India had about 600,000 square kilometers of government forests, the largest forest estate on earth. It's the model even for the US Forest Service and for Gifford Pinchot. But parallel to that, there was also a very large program to remake the forest in terms of its ecology. We've heard a lot about, growing stock, selective maturing of timber trees and so on and so forth. But along with that, there's vast campaigns to exterminate vermin. Let me give you a figure. In a typical year, these are the numbers killed for which rewards were given. 1,500 tigers, 3,000 leopards, 4,000 wolves. Now, the population of tigers we now have in India, and these are estimates, with more modern techniques, is less than that. It's somewhere between 1,141, they're very precise, these estimates, and 1,600. Now, if you are able to get an offtake of 1,500 tigers, one self-respecting tiger, a male, would eat, this is the work of Ullas Karanth and other biologists, would eat about 50 deer a year. A tigress raising cubs would kill about 80 a year. So if you have one tiger or tigress and have 400 to 500 wild ungulates to support them, you can conceive of what kind of ungulate populations and carnivore populations we're talking about just 100 years ago. There's a biologist who worked on the rhino in Nepal, and he looked at very intensive study of rhino densities, and he back projected a very interesting figure. He estimated that about 200 years ago, when much of the Gangetic Plain was wet savanna, and there were extensive savannas till fairly recently in much of South Asia, both wet and dry, he estimated the number of rhinos would have been probably 80,000. So, remember, this is an area where denudation, and I must use the word denudation, is fairly recent in a lasting sense. As recently as 1600, probably about 75% of the subcontinent was not under permanent tillage. Today, that figure is about 50%. So I think there's a huge change which is fairly recent. So I think it's useful to talk in terms of thousands, hundreds of years, but we're living through the last 15 to 20 decades of rapid change. The two things which stand out then. One of them, I think, is that prior to the British period, there's a lot of flux. In the late 19th century on, this pushing back becomes permanent. The pushing back goes together with the process of enclosure. The process of enclosure is a lovely phrase used by Michael Williams. He asks whether the Forest Department in British India was a crowning administrative achievement, or was it a festering sore in the body politic? And I think the answer is simple, it was both. It was an administrative achievement, but it was a festering sore because the manner in which forestry was done meant intruding in all of the ways in which peoples use the forest, lops, tops, shifting cultivation, hunting, so on and so forth. What I find really interesting is that if you look at the depth and the sharpness of the divisions in India today about how to save the forest, or how to save its key megastar, what is the word, charismatic megafaunal species, you find it amazing how many of these debates have roots in the past. But to understand this, I want to take the spotlight away from the British and go back to the princes, one of whom was host to Philip's hunt in 1961. Princely India covered about a third of India. And I find princely India fascinating because from around 100 years ago, many of the princes anticipated much of today's conservation practice. They, remember, were extremely brutal both in the manner in which they hunted. If I give you bag sizes, there's one prince, very important one, of Sarguja, and he personally killed 1,100 tigers and 2,000 panthers. And I can multiply the instances. But what I'm interested in is not the record of slaughter, not even the record of exclusion, which was brutal, but the fact of renaturing of the forest, which takes place in many of these princely states. One of the first large cats to be protected in the world was the lion, already down to its last foothold in Gir forest. Over 100 years, it disappears across much of central and North India, killed not only because of British bounty hunting and sport hunting, but also because it has historically had very deep conflicts with cattle keeping. So the incentives were picked up. Now, the lions of Gir were protected so that a few could be shot by the local ruler and his guests. But interestingly, there were also compensations paid to cattle keeping pastoralists who lost them. This, to my knowledge, is the first such instance. Now, it's interesting, lions, like tigers, are peripatetic creatures. I've used the term in the beginning of the paper, faunal enclave. While the lions didn't know it was an enclave, they walked. And they often walked across, not just out of the forest, but out of the dominion of Junagadh, this princely state. And it's very interesting, some of the neighboring states, Bhavnagar in particular in the 1920s, entices lions back by doing what today would be regarded as habitat improvement and creation of water holes, controls on grazing, rebuilding a prey base, and so on and so forth. There are other such instances, the creation of wetlands, Bharatpur, very famous wetland near Delhi. So I think that in terms of renaturing, the princes anticipate a lot of what comes to be wildlife preservation in independent India. I'll end with just one instance. By the 20s, in many princely states, the tiger was transformed from a vermin into a game animal. And it's interesting, some of the reserves in southern India are actually constituted out of the old tiger shooting blocks of the Maharaja, who also had certain areas which we would today call core areas, where there was no forestry, no hunting. These were breeding zones where the animals could breed drag. What is fascinating is that particularly in North and Central India, there are even reintroductions of extinct species, locally extinct species, 3 of them. The tiger in Dungarpur, the lion in Kuno in central India, and the leopard in Kutch. And all of these go back and they breed and they recolonize these areas. Some of these led to sharp conflict. So the lions of Kuno, they were interestingly brought in from the Sudan because the Nawab of Junagadh was unwilling to part with his lions. He had the only lions in Asia. These lions actually not just moved out of the reserve, they became cattle killers and man-eaters, and they were eventually shot. Now let me fast forward and come to the irony of ironies. What is interesting is that at the time of independence in 1947, the conservation of fauna or of the forest was not a priority. as is common with other states, I'd say Ghana, Nigeria, Malaysia, and others, would be that in the immediate post-war world, growth was a priority. And this includes industrial growth, it includes agricultural extension and expansion. And I think that all of these tendencies to clear the forest, replace it, destroy it, improve it, transform it, all of this gets enormous impetus in the first 20 odd years after independence. By the late 1960s, there's a very interesting shift. I've elsewhere used the term ecological patriotism to signify this. And I think one person who represents this very well is Indira Gandhi, because the kind of assertive nationalism she was associated with finds a very interesting logical corollary in the argument. I have a quote here which is very lovely. She talks in 1969 in an IUCN session about how we must earn foreign exchange, but not at the cost, quote, of the life and liberty of some of the most beautiful inhabitants of our land. Now, this is a very interesting term where, notions of life and liberty are applied to these animals. But this is a period in the 70s, therefore, when wildlife preservation actually begins to move into the center of the agenda. It's a very major break because remember, the first director of Project Tiger, when asked, what are you going to do in the tiger reserves? These were select 9 habitats where the tiger was to recover. Said, oh, that's very simple. We plan to do nothing and not let anybody do anything. That's hands-off preservation. What he was saying is we're not going to do forestry, we're going to let nature take its own course. And this is it's a huge break epistemically from what existed earlier. However, and I think this is very interesting, precisely at the time, 1969, when Indira Gandhi abolished the privy purses, took away the privileges of the princes, no more hunts for Prince Philip. The next time he went to Ranthambore, he went to the camera. But that's an aside. But it's precisely at this time that many of these princely habits and princely styles of management become government policy in national parks and wildlife sanctuaries. There's a parallel with the British aristocracy and their ideas being taken on just at the time Britain becomes a wider democracy. This is interesting even in terms of the systems of monitoring, because India in 1972 organized the first national census of a vertebrate other than Homo sapiens. And what they used was a pug mark technique. Now, this was something fascinating because it was used by shikaris or hunters in most princely states. The idea being that just as every person had a fingerprint, remember fingerprinting was started by the Imperial Police Service about 100 years ago in India, every tiger was supposed to have a distinctive pug mark. And this system continues right into the 2000s, even after other more valid systems are tried out in India by Indian biologists. And I think here we come to something very interesting. Yesterday, Kathy was referring to how there is a tendency in colonial environmental history writing to delink the forest and the field. But I think there's a very important reason for this, and I think it's a historical reason. See, if you look at the late 19th century, it's a time when power in terms of fields devolved downward due to a variety of peasant movements, both in areas where peasants paid revenue to the state and in areas where there were landed intermediaries. The power of taking the rent declined, and gradually the peasantry asserted itself. So if you take a very rough cut between, say, 1860 and 1920, you'll find the land revenue falls. Take the reverse cut. Between 1890 and 1920, the forest revenue tripled. And along with that, there was an accretion of power upward. The most important person in any government forest is the DFO Sahab, Divisional Forest Officer. And they are recreated, of course, after India, right across the British Empire. In fact, if you remember, there's one book all of you would have read, The Jungle Book by Kipling. If you remember the last story, In the Rook, which was the first to be published, Mowgli ends his life as a British forest guard. And his main job, Kipling says that the most important department of the empire is the forest department. Because it is these lads who've been trained in Nancy and Oxford or whatever, they guard the forest, they provide the timber which builds the railways of the Raj. And he says the job of the forest guard is to drive away the goats so that the saplings can grow into mighty trees. So I think that accretion of power and the movement of power upward, which took place in the 19th century, got a fresh impetus in the 1970s and 80s. Now it had an ecological impetus. To paraphrase Richard Grove, it was green nationalism or ecological nationalism, to quote a very important recent book. And I think that if you look at the Wildlife Protection Act 1972, the Forest Conservation Act 1980, amended 88, all of these result either in intensified control of certain areas, parks, sanctuaries, or in more power to the federal government as opposed to state government. So the Forest Conservation Act is explicitly stating that if you want to clear an area of forest more than 10 hectares, you need federal government permission. Now, this is where I think there's a change from the end of the 90s. And I want to clarify that this change is seen very differently by different actors. You know, there's a very famous saying that one man's meat is another's poison. I think in the ecological sense, you could say that one person's notion of a perfect landscape could be another's notion of a total nightmare. And you see that not only in terms of physical landscapes, but in terms of the politics of the fauna and the forest today. A few years after Clinton visited Ranthambore, there was very interesting evidence that the tiger had been exterminated in a very important tiger reserve not far from Ranthambore called Sariska. So first recorded tiger extinction in a tiger reserve. It led to a constitution of a tiger task force. It was a 5-member force. It's the first conservation force in Indian history, to my knowledge, headed by a woman, who actually was from outside of the main preservation group, someone very critical. Sunita Narayan writes extensively on global warming. Now, the Tiger Task Force argued that while you would have some inviolate areas for tigers, you needed to look at possibilities of coexistence outside those areas, and relocation could not be done except in a humane way. Now, this led to a storm of protest, but the following year, the government enacted, or brought into the parliament, and the parliament enacted, a very important piece of legislation called the Forest Rights Act. Now, this act is a very significant act because it's the first legislation which goes the other way. Basically, it argued that initially, that a scheduled tribal or any other traditional forest dweller, now this is a big question how you define the second group, who is cultivating within a forest area as of 31st December 2005, subject to a land ceiling of 4 hectares, will get occupancy rights. Now, the motivation for this was that there have been a spate of evictions in forest areas from the late 1990s because the Supreme Court of India has had a very elastic interpretation of a question which 1 out of every 2 speakers has been raising here, namely, what constitutes a forest? Now, what constituted a forest in British India and in independent India was an area which was notified as forest. Now, that's easy enough. However, the court was not satisfied. Convinced by these notions of green nationalism and ecological security, they argued that any area covered with brushwood and trees, even if not notified as a forest, will. It's run by one of the largest Indian television companies. A very moving article by a 14-year-old lad from a public school in Delhi who says that the Mogya scheduled tribals must be shifted out of Sariska because otherwise he and his buddies cannot get to see the tiger. Now, this is new because this kind of middle-class activism, which sees itself as apolitical, did not exist 40 years ago. The second is the radical populists represented by the groups in working for the Forest Rights Act. The third, which I'd really be interested in talking about later, would be those who would argue for a middle ground, saying that you need some inviolate areas, but they have to be administered differently from the way they are. But you can have much larger areas where you can have joint management, which could presumably allow for a substantial amount of biological diversity with some elements of people's rights. I would argue in a sense that there's a question Clinton, to come back to him, asked Vajpayee, which underlies this. Clinton asked the Indian Prime Minister Vajpayee, this happened at a banquet, and that Vajpayee was very famous for silences. His answer is not known. He said, why is it, Mr. Prime Minister, that your country, which produces 1 out of 4 software engineers in the world, also accounts for 1 out of 3 of the world's hungry people? Now, I think that somewhere there is a middle class, if you like, a bourgeois view of fauna or the forest, which is now taking full-blown form in India. But it's coming headlong in conflict with the reality of democracy. And I don't mean democracy only in terms of voting rights. India has been a democracy since 1952. But I mean democracy in terms of overcoming the authoritarian ways of life. And there are very few places as authoritarian as the Indian forest. No wonder that one of the main campaigners of the movement for the right to live with dignity, okay, I got that right, when asked, what is your mission? He'd say, no, it's not the act, it's to decolonize the forest. And I can understand where that's coming from, though it's a dilemma. How do you decolonize a particular landscape without losing the conservation values, which any of us rightfully ought to value, but value perhaps in a more equal manner than they were in the past?
Any questions? While you're walking up there, I'll ask my question. So are you suggesting that we have a, this is just a flippant question,
No.
a return to royalty in India? Okay, do we have a real question, maybe?
I think there are 14 parties which are perpetuating rule by lineage, but you can see that their fortunes are very mixed,
Only 14?
as far as I know.
Raymond Bryan, King's College London. Fascinating. Quick question. Can you say a bit more about or just clarification, a bit more about the kind of cultural politics and representation of the tiger? It's sort of shifting discursive importance vis-a-vis different actors in the political arena.
Patriotism wrapped up with saving the tiger. I remember in India from the early 70s, and I think Paul Greenough pointed this out, it's known as the Indian tiger, while everywhere else it's called the Bengal tiger. And of course, in Bengal itself, they call it the Royal Bengal tiger. So there's a lot of nationalism and regionalism wrapped up with it. But I would argue that we must be careful with the symbolism. You know, one can easily get wrapped into a study of the symbolism of the tiger or the lion over centuries. And the symbolism is complex. The tiger is both an animal of enormous power, but it's also an animal which is admired for its elegance. So a warrior is normally described as a tiger-waisted warrior. But, you know, these symbolic representations are part of the very difficult animals to live with. I mean, there's very interesting work which shows that if you look at carnivores across India, this is a paper published in 2003, something like 30% of their diet consists of domestic livestock. Now, that's a lot of domestic livestock. And there are places where it's 50, 60, 70%. So these are very difficult animals to live with. And I don't think, you know, we should forget that.
Over here.
Yes, Mahesh, thank you very much. Alan Granger. Now, I'm not an expert on tigers, but I do know some people that have devoted an enormous amount of effort over the last decades to trying to save the tiger. I'm not also a save individual species person. I'm an ecosystem saver. But lots of people in the 70s and beyond decided that they wanted a really focused campaign to save the tiger. Now, you've been telling us how great the Indian police service is and how great Indian forest guards are, and I know from my own experience that a lot of dedicated people. So why has Project Tiger failed? Do you have any answers, please?
You know, I did a book with a colleague who works in a tiger reserve, and some answers are here. I'm not sure it's entirely failed. I'd put it two ways. One, I think that at the time it came in the 70s, it brought about a substantial shift, as I said, in attitudes. And I think that these tiger reserves would not have got set aside if not for it. Probably one major problem with Project Tiger, then as now, is it's actually got an extremely narrow social base. And many of the tiger reserves, particularly in northwestern and central India, are located in areas where there is a very intense livelihood crisis. And that crisis impacts these reserves. So if you look at Sariska, where the tiger vanished, the amount of wood that goes out of Sariska to the nearby towns for sale is much more than the impact of people living within it. But the entire focus of conservation is on the people living within it. So I think that in the long run, unless it has a wider social base, it will not succeed. Having said that, I would be hesitant to write it off. One of the nice things about India, someone said it about Amazonia, is that it's a very large place. And you can easily draw distinctions between different regions. I would argue that much of southern India, where social disparities are less marked, where the state in terms of its provisioning is better equipped, has a far better record. The leading Indian tiger biologist, one of the leading biologists in the world, Ullas Karanth, wrote a very nice piece last September in seminar called Tigers Forever, where he showed that the 4 tiger reserves in Karnataka have actually probably doubled numbers over the last 10 years. But these are reserves where the impacts are much less. There are a variety of reasons protection can work because the conflict levels are fewer. And some of these are secular. They don't have to do with the tiger reserves. Some of them have to do with the reserves themselves. So I think it's an institutional and social challenge. But if it isn't met, we will have more Sariskas fairly soon.
Okay. I think we have time for one more question. Frederick?
Frederick Johnson, Chicago. Fascinating paper. I was curious about possible discontinuities in this story. We get the princely Raj setting a blueprint, a model for modern practices of preservation. But what about the forest in this story? What happens to knowledge of the forest between the princely Raj and the later period? Does it change? Does it get sentimentalized in the kind of bourgeois way that you're hinting at?
You know, to put it in perspective, the sentimentalizing is about only certain areas, and it is in the rhetoric. The overall shift, and I have very little doubt about this, is a much more production-centered focus. One of the big changes is that after independence, the princely forests and the private forests get integrated. So you actually have an expansion of the forest department, an expansion within that of the reserved forests, where they have more control after independence. So in one sense, I think the larger question, which I hardly touched on, is I think implicit in your question. 100 years ago, I'd say the winners were the aristocracy, the princes, and the officials. Most of our work today focuses on the losers. If you were to put a list of winners today, who would they be? Would it be the bourgeoisie, the middle class, and I don't know, the forest officials? So I think there is a shift, and it's very much a production-oriented shift. One big change is over the last 15, 20 years with economic reform, faster economic growth. It's not so much the wealth in the biomass, it's the wealth under the ground that has become more important. It's the land itself that has become more valuable. So I think mineral rights, oil prospecting, pulling out manganese and ore, putting roads through has become much more important. So there's a major shift in terms of the political economy of forest areas, which I don't think is factoring into our thinking. It's there reflected in a lot of the movements and some of the unusual alliances to protect certain forests of preservationists and populists have been precisely against such schemes.
Great. Thanks very much.
Thank you.